If you make a homeless application, it's pretty soon in the process that you'll be required to fill in an income and expenditure form. And as the name suggests, it's simply a form which you write down how much money you're getting in and how much money you're spending. But obviously life is complicated, so you're not going to know all the time what figures to actually put in there. And with anything within this process, these figures can be used against you. And that can be really kind of striking in some situations, cause a lot of people a lot of bother. I'll give you one example actually, where a mum I worked with a few years ago, she was subject to the benefit cap, so she was losing hundreds of pounds per month from her benefit income. She fell into rent arrears because her home was not affordable. The social landlord started eviction proceedings, and the mum attended a court date, as any reasonable person should do, just to kind of give their side of the story. She went into the court. It was a bit of a mess up, so she was sent to the wrong place initially, but when she actually found out where she should be, she was met by a housing officer from the council who was there to essentially plead her case and help her avoid the eviction. And what the housing officer had done is fill in a income and expenditure form, not based on figures that the mum actually gave, so I guess just averages or something. I'm not even quite sure how these figures were arrived at. Housing officer puts the form in her face and says, you need to sign this right now, so mum signs it. They go into the courtroom and the judge looks at these figures and says, okay, I can see that you've got enough not only to pay the rent, but you've also got enough income here to pay back the rent arrears at £50 a month or whatever it was. I don't know what it actually was. So the judge basically says, you know, provided you keep to this repayment plan, you won't be evicted. Okay, so mum's relieved. She goes away again, but because these figures are not based in reality, she's simply not able to repay the arrears nor actually keep up with the rent at all, so she falls into more arrears, and lo and behold, the landlord proceeds to evict her. So then the case is transferred to a different housing officer who essentially has to ask the question, is she intentionally homeless? I mean, the family's in prior need, they've got dependent children. So Officer B is basically there to work out, was that accommodation that was lost reasonable to continue occupying? And for those who are a little bit cynical like me, you might see where this is about to go. Housing Officer B uses the same form that Housing Officer A filled in and got the mum to sign, and from the numbers in the form it's clear that the accommodation was in fact affordable, it was therefore reasonable to continue to occupy, and therefore the mum was in fact intentionally homeless, which then caused a whole ridiculous saga where I don't think the family members are really going to recover from the impact that had on them. Just that, you know, that single letter which said they're intentionally homeless, the damage it did to them is incalculable, but that's a whole nother story. And so this is an example of how income and expenditure forms can be used. They can also be used, or they will also be used, to establish whether future accommodation will be affordable for you as well. There's probably other ways they use it as well, to be honest, but those three are the main things. So to establish whether current accommodation is affordable, negotiate with landlord to avoid eviction, repaying arrears and so on, and looking at future housing costs to work out what type of accommodation is suitable, because any accommodation the council offers you has to be suitable, and that must take a number of things into account, one of which is whether the accommodation is in fact affordable for you. And that fact actually puts you in impossible situations sometimes, which I'll talk about shortly. So every council uses a different form, but it will essentially do the same thing. So it have a number of boxes which are income, so wages, benefits, disability benefits, that sort of thing, child maintenance payments that you're receiving, and then they'll have a much longer list of reasonable living costs basically, or even unreasonable living costs in some cases. And you're expected to fill these forms in. As I say, that presents a number of problems, because who really knows how much money they spend on groceries every week? I certainly don't. I haven't got a clue. You know, I pay what I need to pay. I don't keep a tally on that. And also, when I go to a supermarket, I won't just be buying food. I'll also be buying clothing potentially. I'll be buying toiletries, potentially even, you know, white goods, microwaves, that sort of thing from the same supermarket. So my bank statement won't give me the breakdown in the level of detail that the income and expenditure form needs. And whilst most people don't know how much they spend on food, in my opinion, they certainly won't know how much they're spending on things like white goods on average over the course of the lifespan of those different appliances. So essentially you need to do some pretty detailed mathematics and a bit of guesswork as well, to be honest. Even with the best of intentions, there are going to be things you simply don't know. And again, you'll see the kind of corresponding box on the form. So where you can put a detailed calculated average in there, use that number. There's an additional difficulty here in that if you're in temporary accommodation, then you're probably spending a lot more on food than you ordinarily would be, and you probably would be wise to specify that. So although there's not a box for it, I would literally just write on the form in big bold, this is how much I was spending on groceries when I was in my last accommodation, my last home. This is how much I'm spending now. Same thing with a lot of these different issues. So you're kind of given these two figures because you just want to make sure they're accurate, and you want to make sure you've got the bases covered, because what you don't want to do is say that actually, well, I'm not paying anything at all on heating at the moment because of the, you're in a hotel or something, and then the housing officer says, oh great, you put zero there, so therefore in future we're not going to include that figure at all. Housing officers shouldn't do that, by the way, but some will. So where possible, you want to give the most accurate figure you possibly can do. But then you've got this additional difficulty if you're asked to essentially provide figures to establish what type of accommodation will be affordable in future. Because the energy efficiency of a home you move into, as an example, will obviously affect how much you're spending on heating it. So if it's an old Victorian property with single glazing and no insulation, then you're going to be spending a whole lot more than you would be if you're in a relatively new property with all the kind of, general sort of features you have with the double glazing and cavity wall insulation, that sort of thing. And again, in my opinion, if it was me doing the form, I would basically do some research on that. Google how much does an average household in a 3-bed spend on heating, and that will probably give you a range. And I would include the range on the form and just make the point, if I'm in a well insulated property, I'm going to be spending less than if I'm in an old Victorian property, and just kind of make that point as clearly as you can. There might even be some science to do around checking out how much you're spending depending on the energy efficiency, because every property should have an energy efficiency rating. There might be some additional breakdown you can do around that. I've not done that before myself, but that would be something to explore. So you want to kind of give those figures. You also want to include things like transport, which can vary massively. If you've got a job, you need a car, then you need to include those costs. And again, you just need to not just give the most recent MOT cost, because if you didn't do a last service and your car's about to break down, obviously that's going to be a lot more. So again, I'd probably do a bit of Googling and a little bit of checking out how much you spent on servicing your car over the years, how much it might cost to kind of get a new one, whatever it might be. Because you want to basically make sure your figures are as accurate as possible so that you're not kind of putting on affordable accommodation. It gets rather controversial with things like PIP, so the personal independence payment, so it's the benefit for people with disabilities, because as I understand it, and I'm not an expert obviously, but as I understand it, it says on the DWP website that the PIP money is only supposed to be for things related to the disability. However, it does appear that it is currently legitimate for housing officers to look at how much money you're getting from PIP, but then actually work out how much you're spending on costs related to the disability. So it might be transport, taxis, that sort of thing. It might be a specialty diet if it's something related to some kind of digestive issue or something like that. And they can effectively say, well, you're getting, I don't know, £100 a week from PIP in total, but you're only spending £50 a week on taxis, and that's what the PIP's for. Therefore, they would be entitled to take the additional £50 into account in order to work out what's suitable for you in future. And again, there's some controversy around that. I might be wrong, but the case law I've looked at seems to allow it. And I don't know if it's kind of intended by DWP, because as I say, I'm pretty sure they do specify it should not be taken into account, but it currently can be as far as we can tell. So you want to kind of put those costs in there. You also need to make sure you're looking at every single household member. And again, you might have a family member who has got a particular dietary requirement and therefore requires to spend more money on food every week because they have to get gluten-free food or whatever it might be. So you kind of need to put in the real cost for every household member. It might be you've got non-dependents in the household who are earning money as well. You need to include that in the overall costs. And you might be receiving things like child maintenance as well. You need to put those in the costs as well. There'll also be something around debt. So if you're in debt, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because councils certainly respect some forms of debt more than others. So for example, like a debt you owe to a court would be a priority debt. You need to pay that no matter what. Whereas other debts, the council might say you need to get debt advice to kind of restructure that debt payment or whatever it might be, which is again is good advice. Most areas do seem to have debt advice services that you can get that, and certainly I've seen some really good outcomes from good debt advice services where they restructured the debt repayments, or I don't know what they did, some magic, but it actually made everything else much more plausible for the person to actually pay back. So as well as all the other things you've got to worry about when you're going through this process, getting some debt advice is probably going to be a really helpful thing to do. Just Google your local services, because it's a bit of a postcode lottery. And another difficulty you might have is that you're on a 0 hours contract, or you have some other kind of fluctuating income, which you're basically magically supposed to give an accurate average, and that won't always be possible. So when you fill in these forms, then you also need to put some sort of note on that. And just as I say, I would put it on the form itself, so there's no chance that the housing officer can separate, the actual form itself from the notes you've provided. So just kind of write all over it. Doesn't matter if it looks a bit messy, as long as it's readable. You've then made sure that the housing officer does actually know what they need to know. So again, I'm not quite sure how housing officers deal with that. If you're getting fluctuating income, it's always worth claiming universal credit where possible, because universal credit is actually very good at tracking those kind of fluctuating wages and kind of topping up where you need to be. It seems to be widely accepted as well that older children will need phones. Now, personally, I argue with that. I don't think kids should have phones, but that's a whole other issue. But basically, yeah, those kind of costs, so you know, your mobile phone contracts, your internet, those sorts of things would also be essential living. Again, that might be an area where you can get some savings, because there are some particular deals you get, for example, if you're on Universal Credit, where they are decent services. I think BT does one, maybe, I don't know for sure, but you can certainly Google it. There are some schemes out there which allow you to get decent quality broadband for a much lower price than you would otherwise be getting, so that's worth checking out as well. Again, this kind of exercise, not that you can magically sort everything out all in one go, it might lead you to identify areas which savings can be made in, and a good housing officer, when you've completed the form, as part of that personalised housing plan and the assessment process, they will be giving you some little kind of tips here and there of what you can do to decrease your expenditure. And the final thing I'll probably mention in this video is that you will sometimes be getting financial help from family members. Many people will do if they can. Obviously some people won't have that support network, but a lot of people will be able to kind of get a little bit of money from their family in the short term. This is where it gets a bit tricky, and again, I'm not quite sure how council officers should regard that. Certainly what I'd say is, if you're getting large amounts of money from family members and you're not spending it on the priorities that you currently have, I think whether or not that's legitimate for a council officer to kind of take that line, they probably will use that against you. So where you're getting that kind of financial support, you need to make sure that these kind of essential costs are covered before you're looking at other things. So do kind of bear in mind that, as I say, housing officers will be going through all of your bank statements in detail with a fine-tooth comb, and you will be having those kind of arguments. Now, that's an incredibly intrusive process, but it does seem to be something councils can reasonably do. So just be prepared for that kind of conversation with a housing officer, where you're getting maybe a payment's coming in every month, you're £100 a month from someone. You might need to justify that that's from a family member, and it might be that it's for a particular cost that you have. You know, maybe one of your kids has got a particular need or something like that. Housing officer would likely take that into account unless there's a good reason not to. Again, sadly, there's not any clear case law around affordability at the moment, which would enable to give me some clear information about that, but that's where we are at the moment. There's some really unhelpful case law out there. And then the final thing I'd say is that you need to keep the council updated, because this process can last for so long that you might fill in that income and expenditure form on day one. In a few months' time, your circumstances probably have changed in some way. You need to make sure that they're updated of your changes to income. It might be you're able to claim more benefits, it might be you're claiming less benefits, it might be your wages have gone up, it might be they've gone down, it might be you've got additional family members to worry about, it might be you've got less, and so on. You need to make sure that those figures are going to be kept up to date to enable the housing officer to identify what type of accommodation will be suitable for you going forward. I think the worst thing you can possibly do in this process is to guess, because I think when most people guess, they probably underestimate how much they spend on utilities and food and gas and electric, that sort of thing, and therefore those figures put them in a situation where they're likely to end up in accommodation which is simply not affordable to maintain, and that can obviously lead to repeat homelessness, so to be avoided. But anyway, hopefully that's helpful. As always, if you've got questions about it, stick it in the comments. Just put a question anonymised, ask it as a what if question. We'll take it to the next live stream, which is every Thursday night. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you'll get notifications if you do. Thanks to those who have subscribed. It's really kind of nice to see just kind of the channel growing. And again, the final thing I'll probably say is that if you find this stuff useful and you're aware of other people who are also tackling the same kinds of problems with their council, obviously feel free to share it with them, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, even from well-meaning sources, and I think certainly where I can within these videos, I'm going to be citing bits of law, that I'm kind of talking about bits of guidance and so on. So I'd say that the videos do serve to kind of dispel quite a lot of those myths. And so, as I say, if you see someone struggling, feel free to send a video their way that just might answer their question.